I think it's a near universal thing to be a lot more comfortable with drawing the organic forms of people and animals over man-made structures like buildings. A big reason that it seems so challenging is because you can't get away with as much. The parallel and uniform, evenly spaced details require you to be careful and precise, and it also makes it more obvious if you aren't very confident with drawing in perspective. Even though it is different in this way, you could also be hindering your ability to draw architecture by thinking of it as an entirely different skill, even though a lot of what you should be applying and thinking about is still the same as drawing anything else. The way you approach drawing lines is one of these things that you shouldn't overthink or treat too differently. At least for when you're doing sketches, your lines don't need to be perfect and straight. Imperfections and wobbles can have a lot of charm, and generally don't look unprofessional like you might think. Curved lines in perspective, like for arches, are tricky to get right and can take some practice. It helps to start with a rectangle that the arch would fit inside of. Then you can mark these 3 points and draw the curve. Either just make a guess for where this top point should be, or you can also get this exact by drawing an X inside the rectangle. Where the lines intersect is the rectangle center. This is also a useful technique for getting things evenly spaced. You can cut something like a wall in half, then cut the 2 halves in half, and so on until the wall contains equally sized chunks that shrink with the perspective. A different, quick approach to putting things into perspective on a wall is sketching a straight-on version and then skewing it to fit. This does limit how much thickness and depth you can then give it though, and creates mistakes that you would need to fix. These far back windows, for example, look too far to the right to be properly aligned with the arches they sit behind. You could instead start with a blueprint type drawing and then build up the depth after skewing it. I recommend using 3D for a lot of things, but if there's any best use for it in illustration, this is probably it. You don't need to learn much at all about Blender if you don't want to or are intimidated by it. Just blocking out the scene with boxes is going to be a big help with establishing the perspective and scale. You can also add in a light to settle on where the shadows will be, for which there are different types depending on what kind of light source you need. Lock the camera to your view and position it where you want, and then with the camera selected, mess with this slider to change the focal length. Sometimes regular perspective isn't necessary or isn't the look you're going for, in which case you might like to use an isometric grid. You can find one by just searching for it. I've redrawn this wall on top of the grid, and now instead of the sections getting smaller the further back they are, they remain the exact same size. Parallel lines will also be actually parallel and not ever converge at a vanishing point. This works well for top-down video games, and it makes designing a structure a lot easier because you can duplicate or select and move an object anywhere else in the scene and nothing about it needs to change. A common mistake is not making things big enough. If you're unsure about the scale of something, like a door or a full building, it's typically better to make it on the larger side, so long as you remember to keep things like door handles at the proper height to be interacted with. Even a relatively small building is going to be pretty large compared to the scale of a person, and a large building will make people look like ants. In addition to making your architecture bigger than you think it should be, you're also likely better off making it more detailed than you're naturally inclined to. Even a basic window will often have multiple levels of indents around it, and the same idea goes for the rest of a building. Extruded and sunken-in sections on a wall gets rid of the flatness that tends to make architecture look unrealistic. Random objects, like panels, pipes, and vents, can also add to the believability. When it comes to very decorated structures, imply the tiny details with scribbles or quickly painted in shapes. You'll have an easier time adding detail if you know a bit more about the parts that can make it up. Columns are one, and pilasters are similar to columns, but up against a wall. A dormer can make a roof look more interesting, and buttresses are support structures that can either be simple or a more decorated arching shape. One more is this railing that you'll see lining roofs, balconies, stairs, and walkways, called the balustrade. You generally shouldn't try to draw architecture without first deciding what style it will be inspired by. Fantasy is often based on styles like Gothic and Tudor. Classical architecture is the Greek temple look and has a lot of columns, and there's also styles like Renaissance, Baroque, and others that tend to use a lot of columns as well as domes. One more that I like to look at is the 1800s Victorian era styles, for which you could check out maybe Queen Anne Victorian for a pointed style, and Italianate for more flat and boxy. These are just some examples that I like, so also do some searching yourself if none of this matches what you want to reference. There are some things that I find Pinterest useful for finding, but for architecture it really just gives me a lot of AI, so what I mostly use instead for this is Pexels, which has a pretty good selection of royalty-free architecture photography to search through. To help with conveying the scale of architecture, I have this video on that topic. Thank you Patreon members, and thanks for watching.